Well, good day, everybody. This is Joe. Hey, I don't get a chance too often, or I don't take a chance too often to do film photography with roll film cameras, in this case 35mm cameras, but I did just that actually over the course of the last few months. It's taken me to finish 2 rolls of black and white film, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience and the cameras I used and my results, so stay tuned. Well, recently I bought a few rolls or a brick of Candid 100. Let's see if I have some of that here. Made in England. And this little container, by the way, is Japan Camera Hunters, Bellamy Hunt. Anyway, his website sells these little boxes. I had started out with a roll of this Candid 100 in my Minolta X700. So there's a kind of a long story here, which I'll try to keep relatively short, but you have to go back to the late 1970s, and I bought a camera very much like this. I bought a Minolta SRT 101B. Get some light on it here. This is a 102, very similar to the 101B. The 101B, I believe, was the export market version or whatever. I bought my camera in Singapore back in probably 1978, but the SRT 101, 102, and all that were strictly manual cameras, and so the only battery in the camera is for the light meter, but it's strictly mechanical shutter and everything. But I ended up replacing it with an X370 Minolta, which turned out to be not nearly as good of a camera in terms of mechanical reliability. More recently, a couple years ago, from KEH Camera, I bought this X700, which was supposed to be the top of the line in the Minolta X series, and these were produced over a period of maybe almost 20 years, I think from the late 1970s up until the late 1990s maybe. Anyway, so the X700, as it turns out, is a aperture priority camera. And the actual X500, I think, is really a little bit more sophisticated in terms of being able to have a shutter speed priority, etc., etc. So I put a roll of the Candid 100 in this camera maybe about a year ago, and would shoot a little bit here and there. Every few weeks I would take the camera out. I guess I just wasn't inspired or something. Anyways, I was using this 28mm Minolta MD lens, but I have this other camera I got to show you here that I recently also put a roll of Candid 100 in to shoot up. Let me show you this thing. It has a little leather half case, and we'll go ahead and take the bottom half case off. This is a Minox GTE. Clamshell opens up, and it has a little lens. This is probably one of the smallest, maybe the smallest 35mm camera ever made. You have a manual focus scale. It goes from infinity all the way down to 2.3 feet, and it's scale focusing, so there's no visual indication of focusing in the viewfinder. And the knurled ring behind it is the aperture ring, and it goes from f2.8 to f16, and it has depth of field markings. And this is a really cool little camera. It has a little shutter button right here. There is a wind-on lever that is a double stroke, and it's a little leaf shutter. And the way it works is you have the ISO setting is at the bottom of the camera. You manually set your ISO, and there are a set of little, what you might call watch batteries. They're not really watch batteries, but they're special little batteries that operates the meter and the shutter, and the batteries only come on, or I should say the electronics only come on once you wind on the film. And there's also a self-timer button, and there is a 2x exposure, which is basically for backlight compensation, and then there's a battery check button. And you have your film counter. It's a very, very straightforward camera. There is a wind-on lever for rewinding the film, and then to remove the back of to get access to the film, I should say, I think you have to close the clamshell, and then you flip this lever, and the camera back comes off, similar to an old 35mm cameras that had removable backs. But there is the film back, and it's full-size 35mm. It's full-size frame. It's not a half-frame camera, but a very, very tiny camera. It has a optical window kind of viewfinder that is centered right over the lens, which is really nice, and it has frame lines for the lens, which is a 35mm focal length lens, and there is a needle in the viewfinder that with a scale and a needle that tells you your shutter speed that it takes the picture at. So it's kind of an aperture priority camera. You set the aperture, it determines the shutter speed based on the metering. On the Minolta X700 camera, you have a control knob here that I usually use it in the A mode, or aperture priority mode, and when you turn the camera on, as you operate the aperture of the lens, the coupling lever will tell the camera what aperture the lens is set at, and there is a kind of a red LED indicator in the viewfinder that tells you what your actual shutter speed is going to be. So again, it's an aperture priority only camera, and then you have an exposure compensation dial on the left on the rewind knob with a locking button. You have to push down to set it, so you can go from -2 to +2 exposure compensation in half-stop increments like that. A wind-on lever is single stroke, and you have the film counter right here on the right side. There is a self-timer mode, I believe, right here to the right of the lens. And the whole camera is powered by another one of those cylindrical little camera batteries. And the viewfinder, I find the viewfinder is a little cramped for my particular style, for my vision, my eyes, especially if I'm wearing glasses. I actually find the Minox camera has a better viewfinder. It's a little bit relieved a little bit more. You can see it. So, and of course, neither of these cameras has a diopter adjustment on the camera for the viewfinder. But I find, again, somehow the little Minox, it has just, the optics are just a little bit clearer, easier for me to use with glasses. So these are two really radically different 35mm cameras in appearance, weight, size, but functionality they're somewhat similar. Let's just see how much they do weigh, shall we? So this is the Minox GTE without any film in it, and neither of them have film, and that's 198 grams. And this Minolta with the 28mm lens, so it's 730 grams, so over 3 times as heavy for this camera, and of course bigger. So as I said, I've been out using both of these cameras, and their usage is quite a bit different from one to the other. So starting with this one, I have this leather strap. Actually, I've had this strap since the 1980s. It's a really cool strap, but I've had this on here, and of course wear it usually around the neck, and it's a long enough strap that it hangs low enough you can sling it down at your side. But as you saw from the weight of it, it's more than 3 times the weight of the Minox, and certainly bulkier. And when you put it up to your eye, people know that you are putting a camera up to your eyes. This is an SLR, single lens reflex. You focus through the lens. I find that when I'm using through the lens focusing and composing, that the process is kind of like, I sort of know ahead of time what my aperture is going to be, so I might set the aperture to like f8 on the lens or whatever, and I already know what my exposure compensation is based on the light. Maybe I want to preserve highlight, so I have it down at -1 stop or whatever. But I tend to focus through the lens like that, and when you're focusing these SLRs, at least I tend to do a little hunting on the focus ring to get optimal focus, even though in theory you shouldn't have to if you know what your depth of field is, and of course the lens have the depth of field markings. But just the way I interact with SLR cameras is I tend to just go like that, focus, fiddle, then compose, and then fire the shot. And needless to say, it does take a little bit of time to do that. On the other hand, with the Minox, I've discovered what my optimal operating mode was first of all, it was all about preserving the battery life, because these batteries, as I indicated, I think you take off this little circular port right here above the lens, and that gains access to the two batteries. And my whole thinking when I'm using this tiny camera is I don't want to run the batteries out. If you don't wind the film, the meter is not turned on, so the batteries are safe. So of course you make sure you have your ISO setting on the bottom of the camera ahead of time when you've loaded the film. And oh, by the way, since I'm talking about it, I should mention I tend to use this little Minox with the bottom of the half case in place, and I have the little box tab from the Kentmere 100 film, so that's the way I'm carrying it. There is a little wrist strap that you can put, or just do like that, and it's pretty small and inconspicuous. You can kind of just tuck it away like that, and people don't really know that you're carrying a camera. So, getting back to the usage mode, I typically set my aperture based on the kind of depth of field I want, so f5.6 or f8 or even down to f2.8, depends on what I'm doing. And then you have to scale focus. Okay, this is a scale focus camera. It does not have rangefinder focusing. It does not have through the lens focusing. So obviously I'm going to sit here and I'm going to figure out the red ring on the lens is the depth of field scale. So I usually will focus for the hyperfocal setting, which is you put one of the f-stop markings on infinity and the other one tells you how close you can focus in. The other way of doing it is you simply guesstimate the distances. And I tend to be pretty good at guesstimating distances because I've been using scale focus cameras for so many years. So for instance, from me to the camera lens is about 3 feet. So I would simply set that at 3, and then I already have the focus set. I've not even raised the camera to my eye. Then I kind of mentally, because this is a 35 millimeter lens, I kind of know what the angle of view is. I kind of anticipate the framing without even bringing the camera up to my eye. And then when I'm ready to shoot, when I think the composition is coming together on the street, I double stroke it and I can just go like that. So the total amount of time that I had the camera up to my eye, up to my face, which indicates I'm taking a picture, is only a brief second or two. And it is a drastically different kind of experience from the way I tend to interact with SLR cameras, where there's a lot of sticking it in my face and twiddling with the lens. And that's mostly me. I realize, because I could use this camera like I'm using this. I could say, okay, I have it on aperture priority, -1 stop exposure compensation. My ISO's set. I'm going to set it for f whatever 5.6. I know my depth of field markings for f5.6. I have a focusing scale on the lens just like I do here. I can do the same thing. I could anticipate, okay, that's 3 feet, so there's 3 feet, or that storefront looks like about 15 feet. That's about 15 feet. And my depth of field should cover any errors. And then I could wind on the film, and I could wait for, you know, the composition to come together and just go compose and fire. But I don't tend to do that with SLR cameras for some reason. And so the two experiences are a lot different. I find this camera is just stealthier. I can get closer to people on the street and take their picture. And even when the camera is not up to my face, the object I have in my hand is just, now you hardly can tell what it is. Is that a, what is that? Is that a cigarette case? Is that some kind of an old phone? I mean, it just looks like a little object in your hand, but it doesn't really necessarily say camera. Whereas when you're walking around, even without this thing up to your face, you're walking around, it's hard to not advertise, hey, he's carrying a big camera. So that having been said, I have some prints. So when I finished both rolls of film, and again, the roll of film in the Minolta took me months and months, maybe over 6 months to finish, where this one, yes, I finished it quicker, and I developed both rolls in the same tank. I used, what did I use? I used HC110 at a 1+31 dilution, and overall the negatives came out pretty good. It's the same film and the same developing, so the contrast should be pretty much the same between the two sets of images, and they are. The main difference is going to be really about the exposure. How did it handle the highlights or whatever? And keeping in mind that I think I had the Minolta set to -1 stop on the metering, but I think the Minox exposed a little bit better. I think the Minolta still, even with a -1 stop, it seemed like the negatives were pretty hot, pretty dense. So having said that, it could be a metering problem. I know the battery is good, but anyways. So I got some pictures here. So this is the Minox GTE. This is, I think, the first shot I had out of the whole roll. I really like that shot. And again, I wasn't able to see the focusing in the viewfinder, but I like this narrow depth of focus, and keeping in mind that scale focusing, I was able to get right on the face on that illustration on that magazine, that art magazine. I have this strange fascination with photographing myself in the mirrors of public restrooms in cafes and coffee shops. I just think it's kind of weird. Anyways, I like this motorcycle shot. This is a bright sunny day, as you can tell. The shadows are dark, obviously, in the trees, but I was able to get that motorcycle right there and then between the two trees. I kind of like that shot. So this was a candid photo of this gentleman in a cowboy hat, and this was taken in the lobby or the customer waiting area of the Breaking Bad car wash. Car wash that was in the TV series Breaking Bad. But this is the kind of a shot you can take with this little Minox where you hardly know I'm holding the camera, and I only hold it up to my face to compose just briefly as I snap the photo, and very easy to use in this kind of a stealthy portrait mode. Here is a shot of a gentleman that I met down at the Winning coffee shop on Sunday. There's a group of these guys that just go to the coffee shop and talk, and he was interested in my camera. He'd never seen one before, and he let me take his portrait. But, again, another selfie in the mirror. This was at a coffee shop that had a little library of books, which is what's behind me. And then back at the Breaking Bad car wash, there is one of the cars that might even be my car, I can't quite tell, but being washed, and you can watch it through the window. This is Old Town Albuquerque, which is a real touristy spot. Visitors from out of town often gravitate there to look at the old Hispanic part of Albuquerque. But this gentleman was sitting in the shade, kind of just, I don't know if he was reading or on a phone or something, I can't quite tell. But anyways, he was looking up periodically, and I was able to get pretty close to him with that lens and snap this picture without him knowing about it. So I kind of thought it was a pretty good demonstration of how stealthy that camera can be. And then over in the Nob Hill part of Albuquerque, there is a brewery called Tractor Brewing, and they have a real, I can't remember the brand of it, but a giant red tractor parked in front of their shop. And this was a couple of horse-mounted Albuquerque Police Department officers riding their horses in the trendy hipster Nob Hill next to Tractor Brewing. I thought it was pretty cool. There's a little patio area at Michael Thomas Coffee in Nob Hill. And it has this nice ivy and a little bench, and there's a bulletin board next to it with all kinds of interesting community notices, but I kind of like these little settings. Back at the Breaking Bad car wash, I'm shooting through the window of the customer lobby as the attendant is checking in another car to be washed. So this is on Harvard near Central. In the background is Winning Coffee, my favorite coffee shop, and in the foreground is a light pole with a bunch of poster, flyer, advertisements stuck to it, and this is very common to see in Albuquerque, in that part of town. But I kind of like this advertisement in the foreground on the pole and the slightly out of focus background of Winning Coffee. Keeping in mind this was scale focused on the Minox, so I just estimated the distance to the light pole, maybe about 3 or 4 feet. And this is the International Farmall tractor at Tractor Brewing in Nob Hill. And it's red, as you can see. And this was a narrow alley down by UNM, and I happened to capture somebody walking by the alley right as I snapped the shutter. And so that's just another little example of how stealthy and how much of a good street photography camera this little Minox is. This is on Cornell, across from UNM, near the Frontier Restaurant. There's a bookstore here, and they're always warning people that the post office next door will tow your car if you park there. But anyway, I waited for this pedestrian to walk by, and then I snapped this picture. And I had tried to get both him and the foreground wall in focus, and by setting my aperture a little bit narrower, and it looked like it worked. This is a tourist scene in Old Town. These three ladies, tourists, standing in front of the Old Town basket and rug shop. And I was close enough that if I was holding an SLR up to my face focusing, they would have certainly noticed it. But I was able to snap this little photo without them being aware of it, as far as I know. And again, here's the selective focus using a wide open aperture, but scale focusing, just estimating the focus distance to the face of this Day of the Dead figurine in Old Town. And I have the background slightly out of focus. And lastly, this is over on Silver and some cross street near UNM. There was these two dog walkers, and they didn't even notice me, but I was standing there kind of looking like I was waiting for something else, but waiting for them to both get in the shot where they're both in the middle of the intersection with their little doggies at the leash. And so I really like this kind of candid, spontaneous street photography. So next is the pack of prints from the Minolta X700. Now keep in mind it's the same film, processed the same way, different camera. So different usage mode, and the results are different. So there's a lot of pictures like this. This was just a close-up of some silverware at a table at a little coffee shop in Nob Hill. But there's no people in any of these photos except these three prints. This one of the Anodyne bar downtown, there's a person very small across the street, and then there is a payphone, and there's a person small in size across the street walking. So you can tell from the kind of shots I'm making on this camera that I am not comfortable in public venues close to other people because it's so obvious. First of all, the camera's bulk and size, the lens's size, it becomes hard to be candid. But anyway, there's a lot of this kind of urban architecture shots I end up doing with these kind of cameras. This is up in East Nob Hill, and if you've watched the TV series Better Call Saul, I think this was featured in maybe the first or second season. But there is an episode in that series where Saul or Jimmy McGill has to go to Texas for some case, and they painted this mural of the flag of the state of Texas on the back of an old antique store in Albuquerque, and then shot the scenes like they were in Texas. I'm using that yellow filter over the lens, and I really like the way that sky came out. It's pretty cool. Well, in summary, I have two cameras. They're both nice. They're different kinds of cameras. They both shoot 35mm film. I can put the same angle of view lens on this one. This is interchangeable. This is a fixed lens. But it seems for candid photography in general, easy to carryability. This little Minox GTE is such a nicer camera in that regard. Granted, it has some limitations. You cannot interchange the lenses. There's some limitations around maximum shutter speed. It's a leaf shutter. This is a curtain shutter that goes to 1,000th of a second, etc., etc., etc. Exposure compensation doesn't really happen here. You can do it here. Also, if you read all the wise guys on the internet photography discussion forums, they'll tell you that these Minoxes are very unreliable because something to do with the way the shutter operates. It's a magnetic thing or whatever, and those things will break easy. So I always have in the back of my mind that this might, at some time in the near future, conk out on me for good. But in the meantime, until it does, I really love shooting with this. And as you can see from my results in these prints, it's a wildly varying difference of results between the two cameras just because of the way the limitations of this camera, not having in the viewfinder focusing aids, having to rely strictly upon zone focusing or scale focusing, I should say, and because of the limitations of the battery, I don't wind on the film until I'm absolutely ready to shoot. It just forces me to use this camera in a much more stealthy way, and it is much more stealthy. It's just really small. You can't even see I have a camera in my hand right now. You couldn't do that with this one. So on paper, this is the better camera. In practice, for me, the kind of photography I do, I kind of like the Minox. Well, that's it. This is a little camera comparison and my results. This is Joe Van Cleve, and have yourselves a great day.